Chancellor earlier, will deliver some stability in the markets. However, to say that this is now a UK government and a Prime Minister without a shred of credibility is an understatement. Indeed, it is perhaps a sign of how badly broken UK politics is that the Prime Minister's resignation has not already been tendered. I also reflect, as First Minister, that if I had given in to demands made by Tories and indeed some commentators on the day of the mini-budget to match the UK government's tax plans, I too today would be dealing with something of a financial disaster. It should, I think, be a relief to everyone across Scotland that the Scottish Government did not act so rashly. It will also be galling, I think, that the one measure that the Prime Minister has repeatedly cited to effectively justify the market turmoil of recent weeks, the energy price cap, has also now been curtailed, leaving many people and possibly many businesses without the support with energy bills that they were before today expecting. There's no doubt this is a self-inflicted crisis for Liz Truss, and it is humiliating in a quite unprecedented way in terms of the climb down. I think the sooner this Prime Minister and indeed this entire government departs office, the better that will be for everyone. Let me turn now to something that I hope is more optimistic in laying out an alternative for Scotland. Now, I have a lot of detail that I want to cover today, so I would ask people, particularly the journalists in the room, to bear with me once I have finished speaking. However, I will give every journalist in the room who wants to the opportunity to ask a question. In today's paper, we make the economic case for independence. Fundamentally, we argue in this paper that a stronger, fairer, more sustainable economy is more possible for Scotland with independence than it ever will be with continued Westminster control. By combining Scotland's many economic strengths and abundant resources, particularly our vast renewable energy potential, with the policy levers that come with independence, an economic model built on social partnership and good, stable governance, we can build a well-being economy that works for all. We also address in this paper key questions on currency, fiscal sustainability and trade, and I'll say more on these topics shortly. In 2014, the choice before the Scottish people was framed by Westminster parties as the strength and stability of the UK on the one hand and the uncertainty of independence on the other. The reality in the years since has been very different. It is glaringly obvious now that the UK does not offer economic strength and stability or financial security. On top of an already crippling cost of living crisis, calamitous decisions in recent weeks taken by a government Scotland did not vote for have sent mortgage rates through the roof and brought pension funds to the brink of collapse. It is now very clear that we also now face another round of austerity cuts that will damage our public services, perhaps existentially, push more people into poverty and further shred the safety net that is so essential to any decent society. So that is the so-called certainty that continued Westminster governance now offers us. And while recent events have brought this into sharper focus, this is a crisis long in the making, and it is not a temporary phenomenon. The UK economy is in long-term decline. The UK economic model is failing and failing badly. The facts speak for themselves. The UK is poorer than many of its international competitors. Indeed, as the first paper in this series demonstrated, it is substantially poorer than independent European countries comparable to Scotland. It has lower national income per head, wider inequality, higher rates of child and pensioner poverty, and lower productivity. More and more, the UK looks like an outlier in economic policies, performance, and social outcomes. Brexit, of course, has turbocharged these trends. Over time and compared with EU membership, Brexit will wipe billions of pounds from the Scottish economy and the tax revenues that support public services. Yet, inexplicably, all the main Westminster parties now back it. There is no route for Scotland as part of the UK back to the EU or to the single market or customs union. If we stay as we are as part of the Westminster system, the outlook for Scotland is this: austerity, low growth, wages and living standards stagnant at best, high and growing inequality, rising rates of poverty, economic damage, reduced trade and narrowed horizons as a result of Brexit, and all of it exacerbated by increasingly dysfunctional Westminster decision-making. The price of this for people across Scotland will be heavy. However, I know that there are many people who, even though they agree with that analysis, still have big and fair questions about independence. Questions like, why now in these tough times? Is a stronger, fairer economy really possible with independence? What currency will we use? How will we deal with any debt and deficit we inherit? How can we protect trade across the UK if we are back in the EU? This paper addresses these questions openly and frankly. First, why now? There is an understandable human instinct to hunker down in the face of a storm and hope for calmer times. But for the UK, this is not just a passing storm. The UK economy is fundamentally on the wrong path, and there is no real alternative on offer within the Westminster system. The establishment consensus on Brexit, despite the harm it is causing, illustrates that. For Scotland, not being independent means we are being dragged down the wrong path to a path people here did not vote for. To build a more stable, sustainable economy with fairness and human well-being at heart, independence is essential. And that's the fundamental point we make in this paper. Independence is not an abstract argument separate from people's daily lives. It has at its heart the ambition, and crucially, it equips us with the essential tools to build a fairer, wealthier, greener, happier country. I know, however, that it's not enough to show that the UK economic model is failing, even though it demonstrably is. We must demonstrate that independence offers a better alternative. Now, independence is not a miracle cure. There are no guarantees of economic success for any country. For Scotland, like every other independent nation, our success will depend on the quality of the decisions we take. It will be hard work. But this paper sets out the reasons for believing that we can succeed. After all, we know that for other independent countries of our size or smaller, independence already works. Why would it not for Scotland, especially as we have so many economic strengths that many of them don't? Vast renewable energy resources, internationally competitive industries from food and drink to technology, from tourism to life sciences and the space sector, more world-class universities proportionately than almost any other country on the planet, a creative, skilled and highly educated population. The policy tools we get with independence will allow us to make the most of these strengths. As in any democracy, different governments will make different choices. But in this paper, we set out some of the opportunities that the economic powers of independence will open for us. For example, with powers to reform the energy market, we could ensure that our renewable resources deliver security of supply and lower costs while also tackling the climate emergency. We could ensure fairer work, European-style labour market policies in place of Westminster anti-trade union laws can bring government, business and trade unions together in a social partnership underpinned by greater worker involvement and stronger collective bargaining. This is the kind of approach increasingly championed by organisations like the OECD as the best route to high-wage, productive economies that are sustainable and more inclusive. With employment law powers, we could do more to tackle the gender pay gap and age discrimination, ensuring, for example, that young people receive the same minimum wage rate as everyone else. It is an approach based on human well-being, lifting people up so that they can contribute fully, not waiting for wealth to trickle down while the inequality gap grows. With independence, we can rejoin the EU and be back inside the world's biggest trading bloc. As an EU member state in our own right, we would for the first time be in a position not just to benefit from EU trade deals, but help shape them. We would have an immigration policy tailored to our needs, and we would have the stability of knowing that the governments making the decisions that shape our economy have actually been elected by us. These are just some of the opportunities independence would open up. Another overarching question I know people have, though, is this one. How do we get from here to there? In this paper, we take that head on. As the events of recent weeks have indeed underlined, whether we like it or not, fiscal credibility and market confidence are essential to the well-being and living standards of all of us. That understanding is central to the approaches we set out. Firstly, we describe in this paper the new financial institutions that will be required to help ensure such credibility and confidence. On that, though, it's worth noting that we are so much more advanced than in 2014. Back then, Scotland didn't have its own tax or social security agencies. We do now. Indeed, there have surely been few, if any, nations in history better prepared for independence than we are. To add to those institutions already in place, we would create an independent Scottish Central Bank, a debt management office, and significantly strengthen the Scottish Fiscal Commission so that it effectively replicates the Office for Budget Responsibility. These institutions would operate independently of government and help ensure financial stability, transparent economic forecasting and performance monitoring, and a responsible, purposeful and efficient use of borrowing powers. Second, we address the issue of currency. We confirm that the policy of the Scottish Government is to establish a Scottish pound. We would seek to do this as soon as practicable. The precise timing would be determined not by a fixed timetable, but by a set of objective requirements and criteria, guided by advice from the Central Bank and subject to a decision by Parliament in the overall interests of the country. This paper sets out in detail a careful and responsible phased approach, as well as the arrangements necessary to support a new currency and, in the shorter term, our continued use of sterling. The paper also sets out the approach we would take to securing fiscal sustainability. Again, this recognises the vital importance of confidence and credibility in public finances. The deficit and debt an independent Scotland will start out with will be derived from and influenced by the overall UK position. In the case of debt, it will also be determined by negotiations that follow a vote for independence. As was established in 2014, Scotland would not have legal responsibility for UK debt. We do, however, in my view, bear a moral responsibility. In light of that, and indeed our desire for strong future partnership between Scottish and UK governments, we would seek a fair settlement on both debt and assets. Now, given the turmoil engulfing the UK's finances at this time, it is not possible to make an estimate of our starting fiscal position, though the IFS has suggested that in 2022-23, Scotland's deficit is likely to be similar to or lower than the UK's. We do confirm that we would set clear fiscal rules to put and keep public finances on a sustainable path. We would intend these to align with the broad principles of the European Growth and Stability Pact, which is currently being reformed. We intend to have fiscal rules that keep day-to-day spending within sustainable limits and debt on a sustainable path, but still permit governments to properly support public services and borrow to invest. We reject austerity as both morally wrong and economically counterproductive. Further, we do not accept that austerity is necessary in a country as wealthy as Scotland and with our abundance of resources. It is ultimately the creation of a sustainable, inclusive economy that delivers fiscal sustainability. Neither austerity nor tax cuts for the wealthiest will deliver that. It will come instead from investment in people and infrastructure. That is why we propose in this paper the Building a New Scotland Fund. Oil and gas is a declining asset, and our obligation to the planet means that we must move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But oil and gas can't be switched off overnight, so Scotland could benefit from these revenues for some time yet. If we invest remaining oil revenues and use our new borrowing powers responsibly and for a purpose, we can invest up to £20 billion in the first decade of independence. This investment will help accelerate the transition to net zero and transform communities. And crucially, it will help kickstart the inclusive growth that will help get our newly independent nation on a fiscally sustainable path while building the fair society we all want. Lastly, the paper considers the issue of borders and trade, although we will publish a further paper later in this series specifically on European Union issues. There are two important points to underline at the outset. Firstly, independence opens the door to Scotland rejoining the EU and the single market. That will allow us to grow and diversify our trade in the way Ireland did after joining the EU. Trade across the UK is important, but that must not be the limit of our ambition, not when we have a market 7 times the size of the UK on our doorstep. Second, Scotland will remain in the common travel area with the rest of the UK and Ireland. That means any talk of passports to visit relatives in England is utter nonsense. Free movement of people across our islands will continue as before, and independent Scotland, though back in the EU, will also regain free movement across 27 other countries. What Brexit does mean, though, when Scotland returns to the EU, is that border arrangements will be required to ensure continued trade in goods and services across the UK. None of this is insurmountable, but it does require proper planning. Most of Scotland's trade with the rest of the UK is in services, and we set out the arrangements that will need to be in place to ensure that continues. As far as manufactured goods are concerned, the things that actually physically cross borders, we actually export more to the rest of the world than to the rest of the UK. Nevertheless, we set out here the mechanisms by which necessary checks can be carried out in a way that allows smooth trade to continue and makes clear that we would provide support to traders to adapt. It is important to note that for the purposes of this paper, we assume that the UK-EU relationship will be governed in the longer term by the current trade and cooperation agreement. However, over time, it is possible that economic reality, if not common sense, will lead the UK to greater alignment with the single market and to agreements that reduce the requirement for checks.